Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Night of the Museum show of the Blinken OSA archives from Budapest. This archives belongs to the Central European University, and as you may know, this is one of the biggest archives in the world relating to the Cold War, the history of the Cold War and the history of communism in Eastern and Central Europe. I'm András Mink, a historian and archivist here, and today for this short talk I chose the topic, where did the Hungarian democratic opposition disappear? This is a very actual topic recently in Hungary, as there are recurring propaganda attacks on the memory of the democratic opposition of the 70s and the 80s in this country, which played a major role in achieving the democratic transition, the regime change 30 years ago. Why is that? That's what I try to answer very shortly in this talk. First, I would like to talk about what was the democratic opposition itself. Then I will talk about the problem, how their activities, tactics and strategy formed their views on the regime change and the future democratic republic of the post-communist times. Then I will jump to the topic, why these images, visions and views could not fit and cannot fit to the recent official historical narratives of the recent past of the Orbán-regime. And finally, I tried to describe very shortly how the recent regime propaganda tried to undermine and discredit the memory and the tradition of the democratic opposition. So, what was democratic opposition in the 70s and in the 80s? There were many sorts of opposition groups in the country. For example, the national populist opposition, an opposition that had its roots in the Hungarian 1956 revolution. There were opposition circles stemming from the non-communist democratic parties of the early post-war historical times, but this democratic opposition represented a new generation of dissident politicians. Most of them was born after the Second World War, and they really represented a new wave and a new trend in dissident politics in Hungary. What were the factors that differentiated this group from the other groups? Most importantly, they based their activities, their tactics and strategy on human rights. As you may know, the Helsinki Accord that was adopted in 1975, which agreement was signed by the Western powers and the Soviet bloc countries as well, in its third basket defined a set of basic human rights which the signatory parts accorded and acknowledged to comply. This was an international agreement, an international contract, but it had no real enforceable mechanism to fulfill these human rights principles. But this agreement gave a new strength and a new impetus of dissident movements in Central and Eastern Europe, and in fact in the Soviet Union itself as well. The basic starting point of this was that our human rights are not generated by the law of the state, not the state that defines our rights in its positive law, but we have basic human rights regardless whether the state acknowledges them, guarantees them, protects them, or promotes them. If there is any, and these human rights are coming from the very fact that we exist as human beings. Also part of this argument was that if the state laws, the legal system or the legal rules are in contradiction with these basic human rights, then these laws can be disregarded and these laws shall be changed in favor of a better fulfillment of these human rights principles. So this movement based its claim, which was a sort of civil disobedience. They really owed a lot to the civil liberty movements of the early 50s in the US and in the western part of the world, but it was also a slightly different type of civil disobedience because it did not target only certain anomalies within the existing legal system, but it targeted and tried to undermine the dictatorial rule as a whole. The other novelty in this democratic opposition that they started to behave as free persons. They started to practice these human rights openly and on a demonstrative way, which in fact they refused this tacit agreement between the society and the political system that in private spaces you can think and talk whatever you want, but you cannot present your critical ideas publicly because it was regarded and treated as a criminal offense, as a conspiracy against state rule or even high treason in many of these countries. So it was a sort of civil disobedience, but on the other hand, at the same time, it tried to utilize all the potentials of the existing positive law as well in order to protect themselves from the retortions of the state. So on the one way, they stepped in a legal sphere with one of their legs. On the other hand, they stood in the domain of civil disobedience when they demonstratively disregarded regulations that were in contrast of human rights principles. Let me illustrate this tactic and strategy with three examples. All of them had a certain contact with László Rajk, who died last year, who was an architect and an artist and an emblematic figure of the Hungarian democratic opposition. I would like to ask my colleague to show the first picture, which is the cover page of the first regularly published Hungarian samizdat periodical, Beszélő, Speaker. László Rajk was not the editor or the founder of this periodical, but he was the typographer and sometimes the printer of this journal. Let's jump to the second illustration. This is the colophon of this periodical, of the first copy or first edition of this periodical, and you can see that unlike previously, the editors of this journal made public their names, their addresses, and phone numbers. This was a pretty unusual gesture because what we could expect that these sort of enterprises carried some danger for those who acted in such a way. So it was better to hide your names, your identity, remain anonymous, or use cover names for this publication, but they behaved just quite the contrary. It was a challenge and in a certain way a call for the state authorities that if you want to hunt us down, you can find us here. Part of this strategy was that they realized that publicity entering the public space is not only a danger, but in certain situations it could provide a certain protection for the actors. Also, it was a challenge because it put a pressure on the authorities whether they in fact go after them, arrest them, or harass them, or stop the publication of this journal. In this way, they make obvious that they disregard those international agreements they signed in Helsinki. They uncover their real character, their dictatorial face, both in the domestic and in the international field. Or if they do not dare to do that, or decide for certain reasons not to do that, they must tolerate such kind of so-called illegal activities that give step by step more and more space for expanding dissident activities, occupying more and more free space within the framework of a dictatorial system. The next 5 pictures or images, which is a slideshow, it's again a good example of how they could play in this gray zone of illegality and legality. In the middle, with a black case, we can see Ferenc Kőszeg, who was one of the editors of this Beszélő journal, and this was the time in late spring, early summer 1982, when the state security forces decided to change their tactics. They tried to intimidate and stop dissident activities by means of strict follow-up, which meant that the state security agents gathered around the activists of these dissident circles, and they constantly harassed them, whispered into their ears threatening messages, and made it clear that they are under chase. This is, but the trick was that Ferenc Kőszeg, when he left the building in the morning, these agents immediately surrounded him and started their evil activities. When suddenly Mr. Kőszeg started to run, and the agents decided to run after him, and in a car at the next corner they were sitting Gábor Demszky and László Rajk, who photographed the whole incidents. In the last picture of this series, you can see as the leader, commander of this task force of state security agents, show his surprise. But the question is why they were not arrested and why the camera had not been confiscated. The answer is because in that case, these agents would have had to uncover their true identity and make it and made it clear that this was an official action of the Hungarian state authorities, the regular police, the police forces of the Hungarian state, again uncovered the true face, the true nature, the true character of this of this dictatorial rule. And the third part of these illustrations is showing the Reich boutique, László Reich's small flat in downtown Budapest, where he ran a sort of samizdat boutique. This was a pop-up shop. You could go there to see the products and order the copies what you really wanted to have or needed. This samizdat boutique started sometimes in mid-1981, and it could survive until January 1983, despite all of the harassments and threats imposed upon László Reich himself. Once he was summoned by the chief censor's office of the Hungarian Communist Party, where the officials tried to intimidate him, tried to threaten him that this was a criminal offense what he did, so he might count with serious consequences. For that, Reich replied that, okay, what is your problem? The content is the problem. If the content is the problem, I'm not responsible for the content because I do not write. I'm not the author of these publications. Of course, that was a challenge that if the content is the problem, again, the Hungarian state officials must admit that there is censorship in this country, despite all of their promises. Then Reich continued and said that, okay, if the problem is that I'm doing a sort of an illegal commercial activity, I submit an application for a permission of commercial activities, when the reply came that this office is not in charge of commercial affairs. So then Reich stood up and said that, no, gentlemen, we do not have anything to talk about. And he walked out from the scene. So this is again how they somehow widened the space of resistance. What was the natural consequence of this worldview, of this political political strategy, of this political attitude? When the opportunity that the regime could be changed on a fundamental way in the late 80s, it was quite obvious that for the representatives of the democratic opposition, that there now is a chance to create a real constitutional democratic state, a multi-party parliamentary system in which the basic rights are not just codified in the constitution, but also there are legal and institutional guarantees of these basic human and political rights, guarantees for the freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, equal treatment before law, and so on and so on. And there is no compromise that has to be made with the party state in these matters. Also, this project somehow included the principle of the neutrality of the state. So the state must not make any difference among its citizens on the basis of their worldview, moral convictions, religious faiths, denominations, or their status as ethnic, cultural, or other sort of belonging to other sort of minorities. Let me just call the attention to the fact that there was a young legal scholar, Orbán Viktor, who in the last round of the National Roundtable discussions, he was the one who argued most ardently and most persuasively against the last attempts of the Communist Party, who wanted to preserve or to include the notion of democratic socialism into the text of the new constitution. In fact, there was not a deep consensus among the intellectuals and political parties about the ultimate value of liberal democracy, which was coming into birth in those days, but still for most of the political actors this was the best available option to choose the Western model to which Hungary always wanted to belong to. So then, to answer the question why the tradition of the democratic opposition cannot find its place in the official historical narratives of the recent regime, I think it's quite obvious from what I said before. Just have a look at the basic law which was adopted in 1911 by the new Hungarian government, by the second Orbán government and by the new parliament. In its first lines it denies the state of neutrality, as it defines the Hungarian state as basically and fundamentally a Christian one. By this act, millions of Hungarians found themselves in the ranks of being secondary citizens, whose worldview, political and moral ideas, convictions, even their alternative views on Christianity could not be taken into account in an equal way anymore within the framework of this new constitution. In this way, for example, this made possible that the parliament initiated legislation, a discrimination against certain Christian denominations that did not belong to the historical churches of Hungary. Also, this new basic law defined not just the basic human rights and the guarantees, but also it defined duties and obligations for true and honest Hungarian citizens. This is completely at odds with the philosophy of the democratic opposition, which said that we don't have to deserve human rights. It's not a privilege, it's not the state that defines us, but we possess them as we are existing here as human beings. Again, it was not a completely irrelevant. These were not completely irrelevant passages in the new constitution, because this made possible for the Hungarian parliament to have legislation which criminalized, for example, the homeless people in Hungary, or curtailed the rights in the new labor code of the employees who had less and less tools and instruments in order to protect their interests against the private and state enterprises. Again, as you could see, financing in an enormous scale, public financing of party and power propaganda, the monopolization of public media, and an overwhelming part of the private media as well, again spending billions of Hungarian taxpayers' money to accomplish this goal, is again a serious offense against the principle of the equality of citizens, as they could not have their views in public spheres and public spaces. And again, we can see that there is a constant recalibration and reorganization of the election system and rules in favor of the ruling party, which is really questioning that in Hungary free and democratic elections can and could be held anymore. And we can continue with the destruction or the occupation of independent government and checks and balance institutions, the deprivation of the university autonomy, or the destruction of the autonomy of academic or cultural institutions, and so on and so on. So all in all, it is quite obvious that all of these features and characters of the new Orbán regime are completely in contradiction with the democratic aims and visions of the democratic opposition of the 70s and the 80s in Hungary. So, and how did the regime propaganda how does it try to discredit the memory and tradition of the democratic opposition? We can identify three basic fields. One, they question their role in the democratic transition 30 years ago. The claim is that it was just a semi-transition. The politicians of those times gave unnecessary concessions to the ruling party, to the representatives of the ancien regime. They agreed not to create a new constitution, but just modifying the old Stalinist one back in 1949. Formally, that is true. The new constitution that was adopted in 1990 was formally a modification of the 1949 Stalinist constitution, but in fact, in all of this, in all the aspects, it was a complete rupture and denial, both in political, moral, and legal sense, of the content of the previous communist constitution. In fact, what happened, that as I tried to describe in the previous chapter, the constitution making of the new Orbán regime was in fact the real historical step back in this respect, as they reintroduced biased ideological claims and visions into the text of the constitution, which enabled the parliament and the executive power to curtail seriously basic human rights and to undermine the rule of law in this country. The second track of discrediting did not only question the historical role of the democratic opposition, but tried to undermine their historical identity, claiming that they could be opposition, they could be a dissident movement only because they were allowed to do that. So they were in a privileged and protected position, while others had to face much more risk and dangers if they had tried to pursue similar acts. This is, I think, completely absurd, and this is amounts to being a slandering claim. The third one is to blame this transitional liberalism in Hungary as being neoliberal, following the doctrine of neoliberal economic thinking, which led to the misery and impoverishment of millions of Hungarians. This is again an absurd charge, as we take into account that one of the most important activities of the democratic opposition from the late 70s was to uncover the injustices and social inequalities within the communist system. That was part of their criticism, and they were the founders of the fund supporting poor people in Hungary, again, which organization was harassed and persecuted by the state security forces of the communist state. So that's what we can say about about their alleged neoliberalism. Thank you very much.